I am Ruth Erno. I served in the Navy, not only during World War II, but following that. I retired as a commander. I was on active duty for 12 years, and then after that, I remained in the Navy Reserve, whereby I went for training, one weekend a month, and then 2 weeks out of the year. And I retired from the Navy with 42 years of service. Now, how many of you who are here have anyone in your family who are now in the military? And how many have a parent who is in the military? And how many of you have a great-parent who is in the military? And how many of you had a great-grandparent who is in the military? Well, these were the people who served in World War II, like I did. I could be your great-great-grandmother, but that's how many years ago it was. And you see, your great-grandparents, served in World War I, which officially ended in 1919 with the Treaty of Versailles. But there were those countries that had been fighting in World War I and who, that by the Treaty of Versailles, were considered the ones who started the war. There were definite, with that armistice, definite rules for them. They could no longer have ammunition. They could no longer be manufacturing ships and aircraft and all of that. And these countries became very, very restless. There was a period of no jobs. The young people were very restless. So, and the countries were really struggling. So in those countries, like Germany, Italy, and Spain, the young people looked to leaders, and that's when Hitler and Mussolini came in power. There was that appeal for the young people looking to strong leaders. And it was with the German invasion of Holland and Luxembourg and Belgium and France in 1940 that started a series of events that led the United States into the world's greatest armed conflict. And this caused a movement of troops.
Sir, excuse me, I'm sorry. If you'd like to use the microphone.
Can you all hear me without the microphone? Okay, if you can, it will be easier for me.
That's perfect. I'll put it right there so maybe it'll magnify a little bit.
Okay,
there we go.
Thank you. Well, on December the 7th, 1941 was considered, that surprise attack of the Japanese on Pearl Harbor. But this was something that was brought about because Japan was very, very uneasy because they feared that the United States was going to interfere with their plans of taking over several countries and territories in the Pacific. They were uncomfortable about it. They feared the strength of the United States at that time. And just a few days after the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor is when Germany and Italy both declared war on the United States. So what was it like to be living in the United States at that time? President Roosevelt was president, and his wife was the first lady who traveled around everywhere, was speaking, giving lectures, writing a daily newspaper column. She was a very, very active, and they considered her to be the most influential woman of her time. Now, before the war, most people, as I said, in this country as well as in other countries, were struggling through what was known as the Great Depression. There was much unemployment, and with the exception of teachers, nurses, office clerks, very, very few women worked outside the home. And they earned big money, about $1,000 a year. At that time, a quart of milk, a loaf of bread, or a gallon of gasoline cost about 15 cents. But the average pay was 25 cents an hour. Congress had passed a series of neutrality acts. You know what it is to be neutral? You stayed out of the business of what was going on in the rest of the world. Because many people had the idea that we were protected by our two oceans. That feeling of it couldn't happen to us, it couldn't happen here. Therefore, in 1940, the United States Army stood only 18th in the world. Countries much smaller than ours, much less prosperous than ours, had greater strength with their army and their armament. You see, after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, and though many countries were restricted with regard to manufacturing arms, well, when it was that in the 30s these countries such as Germany could rearm, they were equipped throughout with the most modern weapons available. And that was a situation that had never happened in the world before. In 1940s, President Roosevelt's top priority was to urge the Congress to revise this Neutrality Act. He saw what was going on. He was great friends with Churchill, who was Prime Minister of Britain. So he felt that we had to be doing more, and he recognized the threat of a German rearmament. After long, bitter debates, the Congress approved funds to train new troops and to speed up production of munitions, new tanks, and new planes, and repair ships. Also, at this time, money in large amount was allowed for research and development. Don't stick with the old, let's come out with what else we could have. And that brought forth advancements in aviation and medicine. It was during that time that synthetic materials were perfected, and believe it or not, dried and frozen foods were introduced. And to help raise money for these expensive projects, our government sold war bonds. It was like lending money to the government for 10 years. For 1875, you turned in your war bond. 10 years later, you got $25. So there were $25 bonds, $50 bonds, and $100, and it even went up to $500. But this was the means of our government at the time that they needed gathering additional money. Now, there were jobs, but raw materials were scarce. At that time, gasoline, butter, meat, sugar, canned goods, and leather were in short supply. So, in this country, we had ration stamps. And with the ration stamps that were issued to individuals, they could get just limited amounts of these scarce items. Certain metal articles were just not available. Hammered aluminum was used instead of silver, which was, the silver was needed for certain of the optical equipment that the military used. And to ensure that these rules were carried out, new agencies were set up. And there was the War Production Board, and they checked on manufacturers to see that they were following the rules. Also, that production board checked on the manufacture of clothing. Men's suits were now to have narrower lapels, not to have cuffs, save in material, and women's dresses were not to have pleats, again, to save materials. And at that time, and I don't think you believe this, is when they introduced a two-piece bathing suit because it saved material. Well, in 1942, it was determined that the Army and Navy could not fight the war without women. So first, the Army in May of 42 established the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, known as the WAC. But remember that word auxiliary? And it was on July the 30th of 42 that the U.S. Navy's Women Reserve, commonly known as WAVES, was established. Women accepted for volunteer emergency service. The people who were trying to get the WAVES established figured that having this emergency service as part of it showed that it was just for wartime, that we weren't going to be there with them all of the time. Because you see, there were many men, not only in the Congress, but in the Navy, admirals and so forth, who felt that women couldn't do it, that women never had fought. But they weren't thinking of the time that in the early history of our country, that women actually fought when they disguised themselves as men. And we had the Molly Pitchers who went out in the battlefield carrying the buckets of water to cool down the cannons. And we had Army and Navy nurses since the early 1900s. Because before that time, on the battlefield, it was mainly nuns who helped in nursing the wounded. But the Navy Nurse Corps was established in 1908. Although the nurses were given commission that sounded like the men, like a lieutenant or an ensign, they didn't get paid as much as the men. When the waves were established, we came into the Naval Reserve, and whether you were enlisted or officer, you got the same pay as the men. Now the question was before, when we had our little informal talk, about what did we do? Okay, at first for the enlisted it was seen necessary that if the men were suddenly going out to sea, they needed people ashore to help in running the offices, not only in Washington, but in the naval districts at the major cities throughout the country. So women who had shorthand and typing experience or learned that in high school or college, they were brought in without even any kind of military training. It wasn't until February of 1943 that the Navy established the first, what we call boot camp, first entry training for women. I was in the first group of women who went to that first boot camp at Hunter College in New York City. Well, Hunter College didn't have a campus, and so they didn't have dormitories. So we were housed in apartment buildings about within a radius of 6 blocks from the college, and that was a great experience. Here you had I don't know how many thousands of women descending at once into these apartment buildings that had no regular furniture. They were all one-bedroom apartments. So in what had been the bedroom, 2 double bunks. What had been the living room, 3 double bunks. In the hallway, 2 double bunks. And in the kitchen, 1 double bunk. So there were 14 women living in an apartment with 1 small bathroom. And we all had to be at the same place at the same time to muster to go to school. So it was an experience. Also, in New York City, when the Navy took over the apartment buildings, the people who had to vacate, it wasn't like, I'm from Boston. Boston, the landlord owns the window blinds. Well, in New York City, it was the tenant who owned the window blinds. So here we were in these apartments without window blinds. And the word was that we dress and undress without putting the lights on. There was always an answer. We were there in February of '43. Now, also you were billeted alphabetically. My name was Rothberg, and my bunkmate was Rogers, and she was not Claudia, she was Claude Rogers because she was named for her father. So she always had difficulty in getting her mail and getting listed on the correct list of where to report. But anyhow, I had just before coming into the Navy, graduated from college. I had my degree in education. She was from Mississippi. She had her degree in engineering. And I'm saying this because most of the women who came in, whether they came in enlisted or as officers, were very well educated. So in the beginning, they still didn't even have the women officers to teach us because they were at Smith College at Northampton learning what to teach us. So we had male Navy chiefs who were our instructors so far as naval history, naval etiquette, how to identify ships and aircraft, and and it was February, it was winter, and my bunkmate had never seen snow before, and it was a snowy winter. And when we got our orders, we were told to bring only the civilian outfit that we were wearing because we would be issued our uniform. Well, it so happened we didn't get our uniform till 3 weeks later, so we were wearing that one outfit for 3 weeks. But as I said, my roommate, like many others who came from the South, were real cold. She had this long-sleeve red slip-on sweater, and she was so cold, she would put her legs through the sleeves so that when we went out marching in the snow, she said that her feet were getting cold. So, you know, everything was sort of makeshift. We didn't get individual orders. It was on the bulletin board that your name was listed and what school you were going to. So first I was on a list to go to Lakehurst, New Jersey to become a pigeon trainer. I didn't know what that was, but then the next day that was changed and I was to go to Lakehurst, New Jersey to learn to be a parachute rigger. Well, that seemed like I'd heard of that before. But then it was changed and I was go to Norman, Oklahoma to train at the Navy Aviation Technical Training Center to become an aviation metalsmith. Well, I didn't know where Norman, Oklahoma was, and I certainly didn't know what an aviation metalsmith was. Well, they took us by troop train from New York, and with the troop train, it's just taken over by the government, so there aren't other people on it. So they took those of us who were going cross-country on this train. Then we went down to Norfolk to pick up some more military. Then we went up north to Sampson, New York to pick up some more people. Then we got to Great Lakes, Illinois. Some got off, because it was a training base there. Some got off the train there, some got on the train there, and then we were heading for Norman, Oklahoma. I still don't remember how many days we were on that train, and of course the train did not have a dining car. Every now and then the train would stop, and Red Cross ladies would get on and bring us sandwiches and beverage, coffee or cold drinks. So, also, as I said, we were always picking up other troops, so there weren't enough seats for everyone. So many of the people had to sit on their suitcases in the aisle. Well, I don't know how many days later we got to Oklahoma City, and then there were buses to take us to Norman, Oklahoma. There were 40 of us at this huge base where they were training thousands and thousands of men. So they had to give us, the 40 of us, the entire, barracks. But we were there during a drought period. And when I say that we were short of water, it was a no-nonsense thing, because water was turned on only certain hours of the day. We could take a shower only every other day. And when you took your shower, you took a pail in with you to save the water, so you had water to wash your clothes. Also, at that time, you ate in the mess hall. Our food was good, but of course you had the powdered milk and the powdered eggs, no fruit at all. And you made sure you ate everything, because when you finished and you went through with your tray, there was a chief who looked at your tray to see that you ate everything. Well, with us girls, or women I should say, going to school, there was a problem, because you'll see here in our uniform, our walking shoes had a 3-inch heel. But when you're working in a hangar, the floor is slick, and you couldn't be walking even with the 3-inch heel. So we went to small stores and we bought men's shoes, which didn't fit us correctly, but at least we had the flat shoes. When we were working in a hangar, to become an aviation metalsmith, you were learning to repair planes. So there was riveting and welding involved. And I have to tell you, I was scared stiff of the rivet gun, and I really didn't know about the flame from the gun for the welding. The men who were in our class, a good number of them, as civilians, had already worked at aircraft plants. So they were pretty savvy on it. And you see, with whatever you do on one side of a plane, you've got to be sure, even if the other side isn't damaged, to do the same thing, because you have to be sure that both sides of the plane balance so far as weight. So with the men, they didn't seem to want to do the mechanical drawing, and because they felt they knew how to do this. But you were assigned, you worked with a partner, and I know with my partner, he had worked at an aviation plant in California, and I know he didn't want anything to do with this drawing. So I did the mechanical drawing. When I finished the course, and I was so proud for got a 3rd class rating. I was now going to be stationed at Naval Air Station Squantum, which was in Massachusetts, and I wouldn't be that far away from home. But when I got to Squantum, like everything else, being either the first or the only, other than nurses, they didn't have any waves on the base. And at that time, the rule was that enlisted personnel had to live on the base. Well, for this one person, they didn't have a whole barracks. So their idea was to, and what they did, transfer me on like temporary orders to the 1st Naval District headquarters, which was in an office building, and didn't have that rule. And they figured then I would be detailed back to the air station. Well, when I got to check in at the headquarters, there was a need for people at the radio station that was right there in that building. And so I was told to go down there. Well, I didn't know anything about radio station or being a radio man, but I walked in there and I was wearing my aviation rate, and the chief, and at that time during the war, chiefs who had already been in the reserve were called back on active duty. So this chief, who was older than my parents, looks at me and it said, "What the heck, kid? What are you doing here with the aviation rate?" And, you know, I just shivered. You know, he's a chief. I figured, you know, oh, he knew everything. And I said, "Well, this is where they sent me." He says, "Well, only radio men here, and you're going to learn to be a radio man." That's how I learned to be a radio man. It was on-the-job training. I was scared stiff. We were in communications not only with Navy ships, but with merchant ships that were carrying cargo overseas. And I did not want to make a mistake, because I felt that if I did, the whole war was gone. And being the low man on the totem pole on the watch, and you worked watches, you worked around the clock. For a certain period of time you were working days, a certain period of time you went in on an evening watch, and a certain period of time you worked all night. Well, when you worked all night, there were certain cleanup things you had to do. And we didn't have, like they have today, burn bags, which look like garbage bags, and we didn't have shredders for paper. So everything went into a galvanized barrel, and our incinerator was on the roof of this building that was 13 stories high. So if you were on the mid-watch, the low man on the totem pole, and on my watch, that was me, I would have to drag these galvanized barrels up to the roof to burn these papers in the incinerator. And I would be up there alone, whether it was a stormy night or a clear night, and I was sure that if a little piece of anything would fly down, that I was going to lose the war. I mean, to me, it was a very, very frightening experience. Well, I was there for a year, and then I was recommended to go for officers training. And I was at Smith College, at midshipman school, and then because I had been at a radio station, I was sent to communications officer school at another college in Massachusetts. Now, when I tell you about having been at these different colleges and many other colleges, how come we were always sent to a college? Any idea? Yes?
That's where the training was offered?
True, but why was the training offered there?
Because they had plenty of room to have people there.
Why did they have plenty of room?
Campuses?
No, their students had gone into the service. So therefore, you already had classrooms and you had instructors. Some were Navy and some may not have been Navy. Because when we went to such schools, you were learning naval history, you were, again, learning courtesies and all of that. Well, when I finished and got my commission, because it was on my record that I had been at a radio station and been a radio man, where did I get sent? Right back to the radio station where I had been in Boston. And when I walked in, and it was the same chief who the day that I came in as a little third class, looked at me. Well, I was now his boss. And he would tell people who came in that anything that I learned about communications, I learned from him. And I want to tell you, learning on the job was something more effective than book learning at that time. Well, my next duty station from Boston was at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, a submarine base, where it was the oldest the oldest naval base in America, but certainly the oldest submarine base, where they not only had submarines that were in operations, but where they had built submarines. Well, when I arrived and I reported in, the chief of staff just plain told me he thought it was a mistake because they had never had, other than nurses, they had never had a woman there before. And so when he checked on it and found that my orders were for real, that I was going to be there and not there temporarily, so I was the communications officer. I was responsible for the radio station, the transmitter station, the telephone exchange, the Navy post office, anything to do with communications. Now, the telephone exchange at that time was a manual board. You know what I mean by manual board? Yes?
And it was a boy who did it?
No, manual board, not board. Yes.
It's, you connect two wires.
That is correct, where he says connecting the wire. It was a switchboard where you had telephone operators sitting there, and a telephone call would come in, and the person would give either the name of the person or the number, and the telephone operator had to connect it. Well, when I arrived, first of all, these telephone operators were all older than my mother, so they couldn't imagine that their boss was this little girl. And but while I was there, the Navy was going to automated boards. That meant there would be a dial system of telephones on the base. Do you know that my telephone operators felt that I was there so that they would lose their jobs? It was difficult to convince them that their duties might be different, but they would still have their jobs. But it was always this struggle of how this wave came in and changed things. Up in the radio station, when we went to, because you know we didn't have computers or anything like that with electronics, but when we went to a system of what we called teletype, Navy teletype exchange, so we had to change some of the equipment. Not the sailors, but a couple of the civilian men who had worked at that Navy yard since they were 40 years old. They didn't come to work the day we were installing the new system because they felt that this woman was changing everything. I never got credited for all of this, but I sure got blamed for the people in the community. And well, my last tour of duty was in Washington, D.C., where I was editor of 3 Navy publications that were used by radio men. And my guest today, back there, Mrs. Finley, at that time, I worked for her father when he was still in the Navy, and she and her family were just little children. And this portrays something that I wish to say. The Navy is a large family. Yes, individually you're trying to learn and gain advancements, but you work together as a team. When you are on watch, you're an important part of that team. Each person has an assigned job, and if anybody fails in it, that whole team is in trouble. And this doesn't matter whether you're at sea or at a shore station. You come in on the watch and you have certain tasks that must be done. And if one person falls out or fails, that whole team is in trouble. But one of the greatest things about being part of the Navy team is it's like a family. You become very, very close. And as I said, with Mrs. Finley, she was just a little girl when I worked for her father. And we're still in touch. We're still family. And I think that I will take some questions. Do any of you have any questions?
Miss Erno, I'm sorry. There's actually we're switching classes, so there's no time, but we really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much.
It was my pleasure to be with you. So nice sitting with you, both of you.
Can I get a picture with you guys? Can I get a picture with you guys in that?
We're always taking pictures today.
I am. That's right. If you're good enough to come, then we're good enough to take pictures of you. Oh, sorry about that.
They're coming in here, they're coming in here at 2:30.
All right, hold on.
Yes, that's
Nobody else is coming in and out. Good. I want to use the table set up on my mind.
That's perfect.
Oh,
That's perfect.
sorry.
Yep.
I'm sorry, it doesn't want to take it. Sorry about that.
Okay. Let them see this. This I didn't get to see. I didn't use this for what was I going to say? That's me when I was in Oklahoma. And this is what our uniforms look like. And you see how stylish it was? It was designed by Memo Shea, a famous fashion designer. And our skirts weren't straight. They had the blue skirts. And the jackets, you see, were longer.
She also helped put together a tree house for years. She needs to shut up.
No, because when I said I became an officer, my master's
One of the things she used to do, she just
had.
had
But the uniform I
the dance. My father put the trees in his truck and we all took them downtown and got ready for the dance.
I gave to another way, because those were expensive. When I went into the Navy, my father belonged to the VFW, and from his post, they gave me my first pocketbook, and then said that for the
Edgy woman all her life.
she's in another pocketbook, because they was together for me.
Because my dad passed
So
last year.
when I
She came.
was retired, I gave my pocketbook to her while coming in, because these pocketbooks were not issued, but they were very expensive. They were very well made, but they were expensive. I digress from what I was going to say.
Everyone digresses. You're allowed to. It's the rule of the day. You may digress.
Well, it was such a pleasure being with you.
Oh,
Very nice meeting you.
Man was getting ready to set up.
Okay, well, we'll get out of this way. Just give us a moment, right?
We got
The
something else?
picture goes
Yes,
into that
we
envelope,
have
and this goes into that.
Bill, who is,
Okay.
here's our